word of the Lord from Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, "Know the Lord," because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. Hello, Marian First family and friends. It's good to be with you again on this first Sunday of February 2025. I want to try today to wrap up our short journey in this Old Testament book of Jeremiah. You know, we really have only scratched the surface of this incredible book, just 4 short messages, and we just touched the tip of the iceberg. But what we have discovered in these few verses as we start this new year has been encouraging. It's not like we couldn't use a little encouragement, right? I'm sure that you're aware of the events in our nation's capital that transpired just this week regarding a collision between a military helicopter and an American Airlines passenger jet. The tremendous loss of life that occurred there. Our thoughts and prayers are with the families who are dealing with that at this time. There's been so much that we have dealt with as the start of this new year. The words of a 2021 song by Kentucky singer-songwriter Ann Wilson have been on my mind recently. Perhaps you have heard the words that she penned. After an accident had claimed her older brother, she wrote the song. It reads this way: "Are you past the point of weary? Is your burden weighing heavy? Is it all too much to carry? Let me tell you about my Jesus. Do you feel that empty feeling? 'Cause shame's done all its stealing, and you're desperate for some healing? Let me tell you about my Jesus." So many people that you and I know on a daily basis are looking for healing, looking for some semblance of hope in overwhelming times. Wilson's song points to Jesus as the one alone who can do just that. This is now the 4th week of our study in this Old Testament book of Jeremiah. While we have had references throughout these messages to Jesus, perhaps to his teaching or to his words, he kind of has been not been in the forefront of our messages, kind of has been the undercurrent there, always there, but we've talked more about perhaps God helping us face the future, or about about us seeing him do great and mighty things. Last week we spoke about God's everlasting love to a people deeply troubled. Jeremiah told them that God had plans to prosper them, plans to give them a future and a hope. The people of his day were invited to call upon God and expect an answer when they did so. He promised to reveal to them what they could not understand. Now, we've examined those promises both from an Old Testament and a New Testament perspective through the words of Jesus at times. But the promises offered to those people, to offering hope to a defeated and demoralized people, are not just for them, but they are for believers today. The verses that we just read are what some theologians call or refer to as the high point of Jeremiah's book. It's my prayer that as we open up these few verses, that you and I could find some hope for our lives today. Now, on a lighter note, this is the second day of February 2025, the first Sunday, but it's also Groundhog Day. And you know the day when the people of Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania will gather to watch a groundhog predict whether we have an end of winter or longer winter or perhaps an early spring. But they will gather to do that. In 1887, the Punxsutawney Groundhog Club amusingly proclaimed this famous groundhog as, quote, Punxsutawney Phil, seer of seers, sage of sages, prognosticator of prognosticators, and weather prophet extraordinaire. The same day, the same year, they also declared Punxsutawney to be the weather capital of the world. Now, I don't know whether or not a groundhog shadow or actions can tell us about the length of winter. What I do know is that God has designed seasons into creation for a purpose. The writers of Holy Scripture understood that. The psalmist would write this: He made the moon to mark the seasons, and the sun knows when to go down. The Apostle Luke would write in the chapters of the book of Acts where he said this: Yet he, God, has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. Acts chapter 14 and verse 17. All of creation testifies to God's presence and to his handiwork. All of history points us to his incredible, everlasting love. Now, something we haven't talked about in this series, really haven't mentioned it much this far, but this is the season as we go through January and February before we get into the season of Lent, which precedes Easter. This is the season of Epiphany. And Epiphany follows Christmas and on the Christian calendar, and it celebrates the return of light. But Epiphany also points to the fact that you and I can experience times of intellectual and spiritual revelation, personal moments when the light comes on and we begin to understand things that previously had maybe been unclear to us. This Sunday, February 2nd, I don't know if you know this or not, but it's also a special Sunday in a lot of churches. It's known as, they have a service called Candlemas, which is a festival of light. It is observed on February 2nd. What is that? What's special about that? What's significant about that? It's a day when churches celebrate the arrival of the baby Jesus into the temple as his mother Mary and Father Joseph brought him in to perform for him what was customary according to the law. And when they brought him to the temple at a very young age, just a few weeks after he was born, Simeon had been waiting there. And when Simeon sees him, Simeon has a revelation. A light comes on for him. It was a moment for him that God revealed the promise that he had previously made to him years before. Now, God had promised the people of Jeremiah's day that consequences were coming as a result of their continued rebellion. Sure enough, he kept those promises, and Israel will be overtaken by Babylon, and the people carried off into captivity. It was a very dark time in the nation of Israel when Jeremiah writes. We said before, his ministry took place about 6 centuries before Christ was born. And he talks about the things that would be coming. But Israel was in a very dark, difficult time. The hand of judgment had fallen upon them. It was a very difficult time when Jeremiah was called to minister. But it was only because of God's everlasting love that he allowed the Israelites to be overrun and to be carried into captivity, because through that experience, the light would come on for them. Chapter 31 contains several promises of renewal for them in the days to come. A new relationship, a new joy, a new fortune, a new covenant, and a new city Jeremiah talks about. Some of those things would happen very quickly. Some of those were far-reaching. The days are coming, declares the Lord. In other words, he says it won't always be like this. It's difficult right now. It's a very difficult time, but it won't always be like this. This won't last forever, which was encouraging words for a people under great duress. Last week, we mentioned that He was doing far more for Israel through their struggle than they could realize. This fractured nation was hoping for their freedom and return to their homeland. Here, he declares that both Judah and Israel, the two kingdoms into which the nation had previously years ago split, would once again be his people. It's important that we understand that had they remained divided and conquered, the promise of God made years before to Abraham would have been in jeopardy. How could he bless the world through a people no longer in existence? If you remember God's conversation with Abraham, you'll recall that Abraham had questions. He had been given a promise of descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. Years later, he has followed God, and yet he has no tangible sign that the promise is coming to fruition. He asked God what he would be given since he had no descendants yet. God instructs him, in the book of Genesis, it relates this, God instructs him to prepare some sacrifices, and then they would enter a covenant together. When the time comes for Abraham to participate, he falls into a deep sleep. God shows up, however, and passes between the halves of that animal that had been sacrificed. In covenant language, what God was doing was taking the responsibility of the covenant, even for Abraham's half, upon himself. Did a series some time ago on covenant. We don't have time to talk about that today. Maybe in the future we'll come back and catch that. But what God was doing was simply passing through the halves of that animal and saying, in essence, he was taking the responsibility upon himself to fulfill both his side and Abraham's side of the covenant. Now, eventually Abraham is given descendants and the nation is born. Years later, his descendants find themselves enslaved in Egypt until God again intervenes, and we've covered some of that. He hears their cry for freedom, takes them by the hand, and leads them out of Egypt. Because of his love for them, God sets the people free and initiates covenant at Mount Sinai, solemnized by the Ten Commandments. Now, we already know from our last three studies that the people of Israel did not keep the covenant. Yet God never stopped loving them. He never stopped drawing them with unfailing kindness. Even in their most adverse situations, he was trying to open their eyes to his love. How else can we explain God's promise of a new relationship to a people who were divided, splintered, in exile? How can we explain that? He tells them the day is coming when they will again experience joy. A new relationship, a new fortune will be theirs, as well a new covenant and a new city. But how, you ask? I want you to notice the wording of Jeremiah that we read just a few moments ago. God declares his intervention. I will make a new covenant. I will put my law in their minds and write it upon their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. I will forgive their sins and remember them no more. Because of God's everlasting love, he always takes the initiative. And he leaves to you and I, he leaves to us the privilege of responding. Listen to what Matthew Henry said. The covenant God made with them when he took them by the hand as they had been blind or lame or weak to lead them out of the land of Egypt was a covenant they broke. Observe, he says, it was God that made the covenant, but it was the people who broke it. For our salvation is of God, but our sin and ruin are of ourselves. End quote, Matthew Henry. Our sin, our ruin, Israel's sin, Israel's ruin was of themselves after years of continued rebellion and going against the will of God. God knew that they could not keep covenant, not because they didn't want to, but because they were unable to. However, it did not stop him from loving them, and it did not stop him from providing a new covenant down the road. A covenant that would deal not with external observance, but with internal transformation. One of the greatest examples of this is found in the life of the Apostle Paul. No one understood the Old Testament or the Old Covenant better than he did. Born, raised, educated, and trained in the letter of the law, Paul could not see the promise foretold by Jeremiah. Only the intervention of Jesus would open his eyes to see the reality of what God had intended all along. He would write in Romans chapter 8, "For what the law was powerless to do, God did by sending his own Son." A new relationship, a new joy, a new fortune, a new covenant, a new city, all ours, and all because of Jesus. Nothing can affect change in the human heart as can the love of God poured out through Jesus Christ. Ann Wilson, who I shared her words earlier, she also has this to say later in that song, beautiful words that she writes: "Who would take my cross to Calvary, pay the price for all my guilty? Who would care that much about me? Let me tell you about my Jesus." Moseley Lister said this: "I wandered o'er life's stormy road, no hope in sight for me. My eyes were blinded by my tears, I could no shelter see. Then I met Jesus, wonderful friend. He loved and saved me, love without end. Through faith in Jesus Christ, sins can be forgiven, and the nature of sin within our hearts can be cleansed, enabling us to live in covenant relationship with Him and with each other. Only everlasting love could make that possible."